Hi guys, and welcome back. Now that we've got our nodes kind of basically set up with the necessary prerequisites for like kubeadm and kubelet, let's go ahead and actually run through the configuration steps for the etcd cluster. So after you've satisfied these prereqs right up here, let's go ahead and do setting up the cluster. And in the first step here, we're going to configure the kubelet service to be a service manager for etcd. And they provide a sample configuration that you can just copy directly into your cluster right here. And what you want to do is just, if you have customized your cgroup driver, then you'd want to make sure that that is set properly to systemd. And you also want to make sure that you are specifying the socket to your container runtime interface as well. And in this particular case, we're just going to be using containerd. So we should just be able to take this command here and copy it and configure it on each of our systems. So let's go ahead and do sudo -S, or actually it's capital E, lowercase s. That'll get us a shell as root, and then we'll actually paste that command in and run it as root to make sure that we have access to write to the etc directory as well as call systemctl without having to prefix it with sudo each time. Then we'll do the same thing on node number 2 here. We'll do sudo -es, and we'll paste this command in. And on the third node, we'll do sudo -es, and we'll paste that command in. So at this point, what you're going to see is that we're creating a new configuration file under etc systemd system kubelet.service, and then the name of the actual configuration file. And all of the text right in here, minus these little leading characters here, is going to be written into that configuration file. So that's basically configuring kubelet, and then down here, these systemctl commands are basically telling the systemd service to go reload any configuration files out there, and then it's going to restart the kubelet service. And we saw previously that the kubelet, when it was initially installed, was actually just sitting in a crashing state. However, now that we've configured it with this setting up here, we should have it in a running state now. So to verify that, we can just do a systemctl status on kubelet, and you should see that the service is in the active or running state here. So let's just verify that on our other 2 nodes as well. I'll head over to node number 2 here, and sure enough, it's in the active and running state. And then I'll go to the third one, run the same command, and you can see it's active and running. So now that we've got the kubelet service up and running, let's go ahead and create our configuration files for kubeadm. Now this is going to require a little bit of customization here. So one of the things that we'll need to do is to change the IP addresses for each of the hosts within the cluster. And this is assuming that you only have 3 nodes in the cluster instead of maybe 5 or 7 or 9 nodes. So if you do add more nodes, then you'd have to customize this script for that purpose. But this is assuming that you just have 3 nodes in your cluster, no less and no more. So we're also going to have to customize, in addition to the IP addresses for the nodes, we're also going to have to specify the host names for those nodes. So let's go ahead and start out by just copying this first header section right up here, and then we'll customize those values, and then we'll bring in the rest of the script. So I'll fire up my text editor here. I'm just going to use Visual Studio Code, but you can use Notepad or any other text editor. And I'm just going to change the file type to plain text. And what I'm going to do is just replace each of these values with the values from each node. And I'm going to do host 0 is going to be host number 1, host 1 is going to be host number 2, and host 2 is going to be host number 3 in my cluster. So what we want to do is go to node 1, so etcd01, and we want to run ipadder, and that'll get us our private IP address. You could also get this IP address from the AWS Management Console or your cloud vendor's console that you're using, or their APIs, but I'm just going to use the ipadder command to find the local network interface. You want to make sure that you're not getting the IP address from the Docker interface, because that's just for the Docker internal bridge network. So we'll grab this IP address and then come back to our configuration file here, paste that in, and we're going to change the name of the node to etcd01, because that's the host name that we provided to it. I'm also going to go ahead and just change this to etcd02 and name 2 to etcd03. So now we just need to update these two other IP addresses. So on etcd number 2, we need to go get its IP address. So let's go find that one. We'll do IP adder again. Find the ENS5 interface here. It may be different on your particular virtual machine, but on AWS, it's ENS5. We'll go ahead and copy our IP address here and bring it back over into our editor, paste it in. And then finally, for the third and final host, we'll do the exact same thing. IP adder, grab the IP address, and then paste it in. All right, so that's the basics. Now what we need to do is grab the rest of the script from the documentation here and bring it into our editor. And all of this is variabilized, so you don't need to worry about customizing anything here. As you can see, they're just simply referring to the host IP address as well as the name variables that we previously defined right up here in the header section. So as long as these 6 lines here have been configured, you can just run the rest of this script unchanged. All right, so we'll paste that in down here at the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and just do a Control-A, Control-C to copy that to my clipboard. And then we'll bring it over back onto node number 1 here. And I'm going to paste that in. And you want to make sure that you're running this as root as well, because in a moment here, we're going to be running some other commands that require write access to some special files. And if you're not running as root, then you'll get a bunch of permission denied errors. So, all right, so we've ran that. So now what we can do is come over here and we'll go to the next step where we generate the certificate authority. But before we do that, I actually want to just do a quick verification here and list the items in the temp directory here, because there should be a folder for each node in our cluster. So let's go ahead and go back to node number 1 here. I'll just clear the screen and we'll do ls/temp. And as you can see, sure enough, there is a folder for each of the nodes within the cluster. And then if we drill into one of those folders here, you can see that we've got a kubeadm CFG file, and that's just going to have a basic configuration for each of the nodes here. So it's substituted a bunch of IP addresses in here for us. And so at this point, we can just go ahead and use this configuration as is, and you'll see it plugged in our host names here as well as the IP addresses. So everything is configured correctly for each of these nodes. All right, so we can move on to the next step now that we've verified that those files are in place. And the next part here is to actually generate a new certificate authority. And this can be handled by the kubeadm utility. So what we're going to do is run kubeadm init and go to the phase named certs, and then there's a specific phase known as the etcd-ca step that will generate a new certificate authority key. And then that's going to appear on the first node under the etc Kubernetes PKI etcd directory as a public key certificate as well as a private key. So we'll go ahead and run that on the node 1. So make sure you find node number 1 in your cluster and run that command, and then just do ls etc Kubernetes PKI, and then go under etcd, and you should see that you have your public and private key for the CA here. So once you've got that set up, you need to generate certificates for each node in the cluster. So we've got the CA for the first node, but now we need to generate certificates for the other hosts within the cluster. So let's go ahead and copy this command up here, and what you're going to notice is that this script actually depends on the host variables that we defined up here. So if in between step 2 and step 4 you exited your shell, then you want to make sure that you run these commands up here to export these host and host name variables, otherwise this script is going to fail. I'm going to go ahead and actually just put a new file here and paste that in there just to serve as a reference point. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste that script into node number 1 in my cluster. That's going to run a bunch of different commands, and that's going to generate a bunch of new files in the temp directories for each of the nodes. So if we go into one of the node directories here, you'll see that now we have a PKI directory under each of the node folders. And that should be true for each of them. So let's go ahead and run ls against the 55 IP here as well. And so basically nodes number 2 and 3 are going to have those PKI folders, whereas the certificates on the local system, which is node number 1, those are actually already put into the correct location on the file system. All right, so now that we've run that script and generated all of those files under the appropriate temp directories, we can now copy them over to each of the nodes and then move them to the correct file system location. And then we'll go ahead and actually set up etcd itself, and we'll do that in the next video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.